Today we are going to be discussing beauty. Now, today is a sermon that is weighed heavily on my shoulders. I know it's weighed heavily on James's shoulders. Why do you think that is?
For me, verbalizing what authentic beauty is in a world that's so confused, that's just a big concept.
Yes, a difficult concept to be sure. What else? The fact of the matter is that today is the first sermon of the year, and it sets the tone for every sermon following in 2015. Except that today is the first sermon of our 5-year plan. So it sets the tone for every sermon following for the next 5 years. Make sense? So we are going to be studying beauty for the next 5 years. And as we talked about, it's going to be it's going to be a lot of work. You can see it right there. When my endeavors draft futility, God's answer inspires lasting beauty. You're going to remember that over the next 5 years. You're going to learn that over the next 5 years. 5 years should be long enough for you to remember that one sentence. What you need to remember this year, though, is that when and my stands for what? James, that doesn't... Wisdom and maturity. Wisdom and maturity. That's all you need to remember. Wisdom and maturity and beauty. So the question is going to be then, how are we supposed to be wise and mature in talking about beauty? And the question that I asked myself in writing this and figuring out how to get us through these next 5 years is to get us to the point where we can disseminate what is beautiful and what is not. So clearly there is a concept of beauty which is authentic, and then there's a concept of beauty which is not authentic according to what we're talking about. And we want to be able to tell the difference between the two. But in order to do that, we have to make distinctions, right? So the first question I'm going to ask is, what is beauty? No spoilers this time. What is beauty? Question? Answer? Anyone? What is beauty?
Not the bastardized version of the world.
Okay. Safe answer. Safe answer. Okay, well, I will tell you that biblically speaking, beauty is a recognition of God's ability to create. Now, probably not what you thought. Where does creation come into the concept of beauty? How does a recognition of God's ability to create come into the concept of beauty? Yeah, there's truth to it, and we're going to be discussing that at length today. But let me give you the opposite of that. So it's a recognition of God's ability to create. That's what beauty is, philosophically. What it is not is a recognition of man's ability to restructure. So we're not talking about man's ability to do himself up. We're talking about God's ability to create. What is the difference between the two? Okay, that's true. Yes, that is a major distinction. So here's the question. Can man actually create?
There's nothing new under the sun.
So then, here's a question. If man can't create, and creation is where beauty finds its power, then is anything that man does beautiful? Hard questions for you philosophers out there. The truth of the matter is that beauty is both a recognition of God's ability to create versus a recognition of man's ability to restructure. It is also a qualifiable standard within God's creation, okay? It's something that has a quality. When we look at God's creation, we see beauty. It's a standard. It's something that we can look to and say, that's beautiful, that's not beautiful. But that is as opposed to a destruction or derision of standards. What do I mean by that? Essentially, what it means is that when God creates, something is beautiful. When man restructures, what he does is he takes creation and mars it from the standard. Changes it, alters it. Remember that philosophical question, though, can man create? It is also a reality which in recognition carries with it attraction to the standard. What does that mean? This is why I say, even if you read my notes, you would need me to explain them. It is a reality which in recognition carries with it attraction to that standard. Yes. Yes. Versus an attraction to peripheral things. What that means is that once you see that standard, you're attracted to it. So I ask the question again. Can man create? What do you think? He can create his version, okay? With God's assistance, good answer. Okay, we know that God is a God who creates, right? Scripture says it multiple times, over and over. The creator God is how we refer to him, right? But God does something different than man. It's called creatio ex nihilo. What it means is creation ex nihilo. It means creating from nothing. Does man create? I would submit to you that man, in fact, does create. But man does not create from nothing. And that is the distinction between man and God. When you have a child and they're making something out of Legos, do they actually make it? Exactly. Did they not create something? They did create something. They just didn't create it out of nothing. Does that make sense? So man does create. Man creates from matter. He creates from substance. Creatio ex substantia. So man needs base materials to create. And what is man's base material? God's creation. Okay. So, philosophical thinking caps on. Things that we create which resemble the base material are the basis for how we see things as being beautiful. Things that we create which resemble the base material are seen as innately beautiful. What do you think about that statement?
Yeah, like I think of art and like Picasso, like he like takes it really far away, not even mixing out, you know, but if it's closer, like a portrait.
Depends on what you understand about Picasso, and specifically analytical cubism. But does everybody understand the premise that I just threw out there philosophically? When we are looking at creation ex nihilo, we think of it as beautiful. That is the standard of beauty for humankind. Think about it across the board. Things that we cannot create that are pre-human's ability to create or even pre-humanity are considered beautiful. What are some examples of that? All of it, right? That's how we think of beauty. When we see that, we see beauty. That's the standard for beauty according to Scripture. Why is that? Because they are seen as beyond mankind. Therefore, they're unattainable. They're perfect because man has an inability to create them. So man, we can't do that. Things we can explain but cannot create are seen as beautiful. Things that we can explain but can create from matter become dull or mundane. So, they may be beautiful for a time, but they lose their standard. They lose picture of that standard over time. Unless what? Unless it reminds us of creation ex nihilo. So for instance, I paint a picture of a sunset. What does that picture do? It becomes a portal for me to see the beauty of something that wasn't created by me. That makes sense? I know this is really heady and really philosophical here. Stay with me. Ask questions if you don't get it. So therefore, the standard for beauty is the ideal of something which is naturally occurring without man's ability to create it. This is called ideal beauty. Plato, for instance. Actually, let me see here. Not Play-Doh, which I think could apply. Plato. Let me pull up the playlist I have here. Beauty. Yes. Now I'm going to show a video to you. I'm going to attempt to show a video to you. Yeah, it does. It wants me to disconnect from the...
Imagine prisoners that have spent their entire lives chained deep inside a cave. They have been chained so that they cannot see behind themselves. And they are forced to stare in...
Oh, sorry. Does anybody know what this is?
Oh, no, I know Hamlet.
Uh-oh, hold on.
And what he...
Hold on. Now we're really working on the technology here.
Imagine prisoners that have spent their entire lives chained deep inside a cave. They have been chained so that they cannot see behind themselves. And they are forced to stare endlessly at the cave wall in front of them. Behind them, a fire is burning. And between the prisoners and the fire is a raised walkway. Now imagine that each day, a menagerie of objects crosses the walkway. Animals, and people carrying their wares to market. Their shapes create an intricate shadow play on the wall in front of the prisoners. This is the only world that the prisoners have ever known. The shadows and the echoes of unseen objects. Now, imagine that the prisoner is released. After some time adjusting to the blinding light, the freed prisoner will begin to experience the world outside of the cave for the very first time. And it is like nothing he could have ever imagined. With his new perception of the world, the man will of course want to return to his friends to share his incredible discoveries. But the prisoners cannot recognize their old friend. He appears as all things do. His voice is a distorted echo, and his body is a grotesque shadow. They cannot understand his fantastic stories of the world outside of the cave. To them, it will never exist. This, of course, does not make the world outside of the cave any less real.
That was really creepily done. Does anybody know what that is? Very, 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 very old philosophy called the Allegory of the Cave by Plato. not Play-Doh, Plato. Plato discusses the allegory of the cave, discussing the differences between shadow and form and what is real versus what is not real. And he presents something called the ideal, or the good. The long and short of it, to just break it down for you, what was real? Was it the shadows that were real, or was it the form that was casting the shadow? But what was it that the people could see while they were in the cave? So that was what was real to them, right? And that was the only thing that they knew. But the real thing that exists, the ideal or the good, was actually not what was right in front of them. The point that I'm making is this concept of what is beautiful, which is another term that Plato uses for it, the good, the beautiful, the ideal, this concept of what is beautiful is not a new concept. It's actually a really old thing that's been argued. And we can discuss more about it, but I have to move on. But just keep that in mind, that there's a lot to this concept. Okay, so the standard for beauty is the ideal of something which is naturally occurring without man's ability to create it. In this example, the standard for beauty would be not the shadows cast, but the actual thing which casts the shadow. Does that make sense? Okay. Therefore, the standard of beauty is the ideal of something which is naturally occurring without man's ability to create it. This is called ideal beauty. What man cannot attain, he strives for. Is that true? We have this fixation with what we can't attain, right? In this sense, it feels productive to him to make motions toward it. Therefore, it's good. Does everybody understand that? Not that it in itself is good. Not that beauty in itself is good, but because we have a fixation with things that we can't attain, it becomes good for us. Beauty becomes associated with good, even though it itself is not good. It is not the it's not the form which casts the shadow, but it is the light that allows us to see the form. Therefore, because we can see the shadow through the light being cast by the form, we think that the light is good as well. And that's where we see beauty. I don't know if that makes sense to you guys. We'll keep going. So what man cannot attain, he strives toward. In this sense, it feels productive to him to make motions toward it, which is good. Beauty itself is not good. It's not moral. But it has a close relationship with good. This is something that has been argued over the centuries by even Plato as to whether beauty itself is good. And that's how Plato described beauty, as being something that is close to good. It has an association with good. Now, how do we see that like in everyday life? I know, we're being really philosophical, so let's ground it. How do we see it in everyday life? Let me ask you a question. Be honest here. If there's two people standing back here, right there, and one is hideously ugly and one is super fine, who are you going to be more likely to approach? Okay. You understand my point, though. It's an easy point to understand. We are fascinated with things that are beautiful because to us, they somehow connotate goodness, even though they themselves are not necessarily good in and of themselves. So it has a close relationship with what is good. What is beautiful can appear to be what is good. Now, listen to this statement and digest it. What is good is always beautiful in its own right, but what is beautiful is not always good. Yeah, everyone got that? So what is good is always beautiful in its own right, but what is beautiful is not always good. So, in framing beautiful things with good things, we then connect beauty and goodness to each other. This type of beauty then is not only physical, but it translates over to pretty much everything. So how does it play itself out in the different things? What are some things you can think of that it plays itself out in? Okay. So what we're looking at is the concept that there is a standard for beauty which attracts us to creation ex nihilo. And that plays itself out across the board in every single aspect of life. I will give you some basic examples I'll throw up on the screen. In art, beauty is seen as composition. So in other words, the standard, beauty, is seen as composition in art. In poetry, beauty is seen as intent of words versus just plain interpretation. What does that mean? Intent of words versus interpretation. I was reading an article about poetry, and one of the things that was being talked about was that poetry is such a beautiful thing because you really take from it whatever you take from it. So it doesn't really matter what it says because it's so interpretable. That is not beauty. That's not. That is something we'll talk about later. Yeah, that's something that we'll talk about later. That's what I call anti-art. But in any case, poetry's beauty is found in the intent of words, choosing each and every word to create rhyme and rhythm. In drama, beauty is seen in convincingness versus fancifulness. It's seen in your ability to portray real life. And what is real life if not created ex nihilo? Does that make sense? We can act within drama that's created, but God put us here and pressed play. You know what I'm saying? Man tries to make that, but really all he's doing is scripting something that he's already seen. So the closer you can get to making it seem real, the more you get an Academy Award. Make sense? In dance, beauty is seen in form versus abandon. In people, beauty is seen like in the physical appearance. Beauty is seen in symmetry versus asymmetry. So we look at, it was Darwin's brother, strange, but it was Darwin's brother, Charles Darwin, father of evolution. His brother did a study where he took composite photographs, he took photographs and overlaid them onto each other, and it was found that people's photos, when overlaid, created a general composition that was pleasing to the eye. Because there was a general, what's that called in math? What's it called? When you do you take a ratio. There was a basic symmetry ratio that was formed just by taking a bunch of people and putting them together. And that was more pleasing to the eye than just the individual as they are, because individuals aren't perfect. When we begin to blend those things to create a perfect symmetry, that's what's pleasing to the eye. And we know that. Like, people like a specific form, like in general. Yes, this. In beauty, or not in beauty, in math even. In math, beauty is seen in ratios and proportions. There's something called phi, or phi, depending on how you want to pronounce it. But it's called the golden ratio. And people believed all the way back to, starts with an E, I really should put it in my notes. But anyway, people believe that everything in the universe has something called the golden ratio to it. Basically, it's like you can always fit a square next to a rectangle, which is the division of two squares. And then you can continue to do this. An example of that, I don't know if you can't see it there. Let me see if I can pull this. Everybody seen this design here? This is a nautilus, okay? It's a shell. This shell is an example of the golden ratio because you can't really see the lines, but if you look it up, sorry, I tried. Oh, maybe if I turn it on its side. Aha! Oh, sorry. Anyway, you look it up, you'll see that the shape continues to produce itself over and over and over and over again. Well, you can find the same thing. This is not the Vitruvian Man, but this is the golden ratio in one of Da Vinci's drawings. Can't remember what this one's called either. But even in humankind, mathematically speaking, you find that there's some sort of, I don't know, intent. And when we see these things, we tend to think, oh, that's beautiful. When those things are out of proportion, we think that's ugly. So, and I want to point out that these things are universal beyond style. What do I mean by that? Yeah, I mean, a person might add something to it where they sort of dress that concept, but even that will show these little aspects. Everything has its structures, which then point to ex nihilo creation, and thus present a standard that when seen creates a connection to the divine. So what do I mean by that? Sorry? Oh, yeah. Everything has its structures which point to an ex nihilo creation and thus present a standard that when seen creates a connection to the divine. Pretty much. Not that it only points to God, but that it yeah, we'll go with points to God. That it points to God. And then let me add to that standard can only be emulated by creation. So a creative process can take place, but it can't be ex nihilo. But every creative process that does take place is trying to be ex nihilo. So now I want to explore compositions in art. Composition, do you guys know what it means in art? It means basically the placement of things. The long and short, placement or arrangement of visual elements or ingredients in a work of art as distinct from the subject of a work. So when you take an art class in college, because you probably won't get it in high school you're going to get like 3 of these things. But in college, when you take an art class, what they're going to teach you is that every piece of art has distinct markers. They are line, shape, color, texture, tone, form, space, and depth. Every single piece of art has these things in it. What I'm saying is that whether you're talking about Picasso and analytical cubism, whether you're talking about Monet and pointillism, whether you're talking about Dali and Dada, whether you're talking about Dr. Seuss, you are going to find these things represented. Whether they're in the negative or the positive, they're going to be taken into account. Why do you think that is? It's a standard that we can't help. It is the rules of the sandbox with which God created us in. So the presence of these things can be found in pretty much every composition. When I say pretty much, I mean 100%. They are represented but cannot be created, and they can only be altered. They're created for us by something that is pre-existent, God, and they are a means by which to understand our environment. Does everybody get that concept? When we translate these things out of our perception into art, they lose the gravity which the artist felt when translating, because an artist can only emulate things, he cannot create them. What do I mean by that? What it means is, when I make a piece of art, I lose something. something gets lost in the translation. Because I have in my mind the ability to represent something three-dimensionally. I have in my mind a relationship with it. When I lock it into a two-dimensional form, the fullness of it diminishes. Everybody understand that concept? So the fullness of it diminishes because an artist can't create things ex nihilo. The only thing he can do is take substance and destroy it, essentially. So artists use, in order to do that, artists use something called the principles of organization. In art, they include all of the things that we talked about, right? Earlier. Or, I'm sorry, not all the things we talked about earlier. All the things we talked about earlier are the rules of the sandbox. Artists use something called the principles of organization in order to move around that sandbox freely. So, I can take line, but what do I do with that line? I have to put it somewhere, right? So, how do I do that? What makes me decide where to put something? So you have people like Jackson Pollock, who is known for what type of art? Anyone? Sure. If that makes it, yeah. It's not Impressionism. Jackson Pollock, he is known for standing on a rafter above his pieces and throwing paint onto it. Okay? So you have people like Jackson Pollock who are like that. You have Picasso, who is famous for analytical cubism, where the faces are all distorted and stuff. How many of you know why Picasso did that? Anyone? So, you ever seen a Picasso work? Okay. You know the faces are like sideways and stuff like that? Picasso was trying, first of all, let me state, Picasso was a genius artist, and he was capable of drawing, sketching, and painting photorealistically. So, but he's not known for that because that's not a skill that is uncommon amongst great artists. He's known for what's called analytical cubism. What he was trying to do was represent in three-dimensional, he was trying to represent in two-dimensional space three-dimensional things. So that's why he's taken the image and flattened it. That's why he's taken, the nose and pushed it sideways, even though the two eyes are up here, and then he moves the nose to the side, and the mouth is all like crooked, and the hands are all crooked, and it looks like it's flattened, because Picasso is trying to represent what is in his mind in two dimensions. Because human beings aren't two-dimensional. Does that make sense? He has lost something in the translation. But in losing something in the translation, even in his work, he still utilized these things. So these are called principles of organization. In art, they are things like shape and proportion and positioning and field of view or cropping, path of direction, negative space, color, geometry, like for example the ratio, that I talked about earlier. Did you know that the human body is roughly 6 of its own heads tall? Da Vinci did, and that's why his art looks awesome. He used math. Lines, rhythm, illumination, repetition, perspective, breaking rules, so on and so forth. The closer that an artist gets to emulating what they perceived as given to them ex nihilo, so the beauty of a person, or the nature of something, or math, the further away that he moves from himself and gets closer to what's being perceived ex nihilo, the more that ex nihilistic things become obvious and exemplified. What does that mean? That means the closer I get to painting a picture that is realistic, the more we can see that the beauty of things. It's common sense. This leads to a lessening of the awareness of the disparity of things which are ex nihilo and creates a seeming sense of euphoria. What does that mean? I can tell I'm losing you. What does it mean? The more that an artist gets closer by using the tools of organization to create something which appears ex nihilo, the less we see ourselves as detached from ex nihilo creation. And that creates a sense of euphoria. What does that mean? Give me an example of it. Either. Yeah, there's that can apply. What are you gonna say, Beth? Yeah, let's take it out of the realm of art. That seems very foreign to you guys. What, John? Yeah, you're right. That's probably the closest creative act to ex nihilo creation. And it does. It creates a euphoria. You're right. How about something less awesome? Sure, there's a sense of euphoria. I'm thinking something that's more creative, though. Let's think music. Music is a narrative for our generation. More and more so, it's on demand. Sophia thinks that she can make Alexa play any song that she wants. You ever seen a concert where people start freaking out because the right song is played and there's a sense of euphoria? What do you think's going on? Philosophically, what's going on is that they are witnessing something that appears to be ex nihilo. And because of that, it's beautiful. And it lessens the disparity between them and God, and all of a sudden, they're involved in the creative process. And they're clapping, and they're singing, and they're jumping up and down with the artist, and together, they create this sense of Zen. That's what we're talking about. That through creation, not creation ex nihilo, but creation with substance, it is possible to bridge, not jump, but bridge the gap between God and man. And so when somebody writes that piece that just moves you, that poem that just moves you, that dialogue in that show that just moves you, that piece of art where you just stand there, that's what we're talking about. There's this sense of euphoria that is created. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just making a point that the tools of organization are used to achieve that. People don't do that randomly. They do it purposefully. Make sense? So this leads to a lessening of the awareness of the disparity of things which are ex nihilic and creates a seeming sense of euphoria, Zen, nirvana, oneness, or even godlikeness. And that is both for the artist as well as the, RT? I don't know what you call it. What were you going to say, Britt? Yeah. Right. 1930s all the way to the 50s, Hollywood was known to take a term that was once a magic term and translate it into something social. What is that term? Glimmer. What does that sound like in reference to Hollywood? Glamour. Glimmer was considered a magic term. It was considered witchcraft. A witch puts a spell on you. She's glimmered you. Okay? 1930s Hollywood, all the way up to the 1950s, created glamour. What they did was they used the right techniques. Airbrushing, Photoshop. No, they didn't do that. They didn't have Photoshop back then. But they used camera angles to present their heroes and heroines in the right way, to present villains a certain way. They perfected a technique in regard to a new technology, cameras essentially, like motion capture, in order to do what? Create a sense of euphoria by emoting, by capturing ex nihilo creation. This person is the most beautiful person I've ever seen. Marilyn Monroe is the most beautiful woman ever. Does she look the way that she looked in real life? No. No, of course not. But what did they do? They used these tools of organization in order to create beauty. Now, when I say create, again, not ex nihilo creation. Does that make sense? Okay. This type of euphoria can be witnessed in the reactions of people as they succumb to music, gaze at art, listen to poetry, etc. This sensation is what is commonly described as beautiful. Whereas the presence of an ex nihilo sandbox for man to roam shows the awesomeness of an unattainable God, it also highlights the disparity between God and man. So the ability for man to create, not ex nihilo, things which highlight that disparity, ironically serves to close the gap between God and man and become a form of relationship which makes man a part of God's creative process of something that is beautiful. So in other words, when man creates, not ex nihilo, using the standard and the tools of God across whatever form it is, man becomes part of the creative process. And when he does that, then God is seen more. And when man jumps on board that train, then God is seen more again. And it becomes this cycle of creation, where man is not simply creating on his own, but he's creating with God. I think Devin alluded to that earlier. I asked that question, and you said, if like God allows it, or being on the same page with God. Okay, so thus man makes something from something in space and time, and God makes something from nothing. This active participation in God's will while submitting to his structure is the definition of God's beauty. What is it that's beautiful in Scripture and Christianity? What's beautiful? Active submission, relationship, productivity, value. That's what's beautiful. But that only happens when man creates. Not ex nihilo, but with God from substance. The delicate nature of the balance between the different types of creation is huge. Okay? Creation, which is ex nihilo, sets the standard for what's beautiful by the sheer presence of it when compared to the creative acts of men. In other words, I can create this bottle, but it's never going to be as impressive as, something similar found in nature. It's just not. Yeah, exactly. That's always going to be more impressive. That's always going to be more beautiful. Does that make sense? It's the ideal beauty. The balance of creation achieved when ex nihilo and creation from substance are in symbiotic relationship is always seen as good across the board. In other words, when I create to make something appear ex nihilic, it's always good. However, when that balance is disrupted by an overemphasis on ex nihilo creation or an emphasis on creation from substance, the balance changes from beautiful and good to something else. Okay, so that's a difficult one. So picture, okay, so I'm going to explain this. Creation ex nihilo when it lacks its own image. Okay? Picture that the most beautiful woman, okay, picture the most beautiful woman you can think of. Everyone got her in your mind? Okay? Imagine that then she is completely unattainable. She is completely alone in her beauty. You can't see her because of the sheer brilliance of her. Okay? Like if you looked at her, your eyes would burn because she's so amazing. Imagine that she refused to do anything for anyone. That she didn't want to be seen with anyone, that she didn't want to do anything for anyone, and even if she could be seen. And imagine that she refused to get with anyone, that she refused to bear even children. Okay, so I started off the equation by asking you to picture the most beautiful woman you've ever seen. Now, at the end of my example, is she still beautiful? Why? Because there's no relationship, there's no productivity, there's no value, there's no legacy. She's 100% alone. That's why she's not beautiful. Because beauty is about those things. Now, if creation ex nihilo on its own is true, but is not beautiful, then is it still beautiful? And I would say no. So an example of that is, if God existed, but he refused to create, would he still be beautiful? Would we see him as good? No, we wouldn't, because there wouldn't be any relationship to begin with. Creation from substance, when it lacks substance, ex nihilo. Picture a baby that you know. Okay? Think of a baby or a toddler that you know. Gio's not a baby. Now picture that baby has been dropped off at a playground, and that playground has absolutely nothing in it. There is no grass, there's no dirt, there's no sky. There's not even a playground. In point of fact, the baby is completely alone in a void. Now, remove the personality of the baby. Let's say that it has no reaction, no expression, it doesn't move, it doesn't cry, it doesn't sleep, it doesn't eat. It lays catatonic in nothingness. Is it still beautiful? Is it still beautiful? No, of course it's not beautiful. Why? Because alone it has no relationship, no productivity, no value, no growth. It's 100% alone. When creation from substance lacks ex nihilo, in other words, when creation, the baby, doesn't have an interaction with something that's ex nihilo, it's not beautiful, even though it's a baby. So what we need is this. Picture a mother and a child together in a playground. The child builds a poor representation in the playground. The child then builds a poor representation of the house that the mother and child live in. You know, it plays with the blocks that are there or whatever, you know. The child exhibits the personality of the mother. The child does its best to talk and act like the mother, even though it stumbles through those things. Is it beautiful? Even though the child's not perfect in its expression, even though the child isn't really creating anything, even though the child's representation of what the mother brought to the situation isn't accurate. Is it beautiful? Yes. Because when you put ex nihilo creation with creation from substance, when you have creation from consensus, it creates the standard of beauty. Relationship, productivity, value, growth, never alone. It's storge. It's love. It's beautiful. It's storge. But then you have this. I have termed this emulation ex nihilo. When created as a first premise, when the created as a first premise seeks to create ex nihilo without acknowledging the source material, what happens? I was talking to my cousin, and he was talking about films, and he was saying that he sees himself as a film buff, and he really likes Christopher Nolan films. And he really just loves Christopher Nolan. So I ask him, and he's like asking me, like, what film should I watch? So I say, well, have you watched Alfred Hitchcock? He's like, who's Alfred Hitchcock? What? And so I say to him, well, what have you watched? And he says, well, truthfully, I don't really believe in film before the 80s. So I'm like, how about even like, late 70s into, what about like Scorsese? Still relevant today, but, from back then. I don't know who Scorsese is. What are you talking about? So I said to him, you know that Christopher Nolan knows who these people are, right? And I'm like, and you're a poser. That is what we call emulation ex nihilo. What it means is that I think that I can make something from nothing, even though I can't make something from nothing. People who do that either cannot create, they either cannot create, where they're impotent, essentially, in their life. They do create, but it obscures the actual ex nihilo creation, or they alter and degrade the ex nihilo creation. And they absolutely always move away from all things that define what is beautiful. In other words, if he continued to move down that path of not celebrating what it is that Christopher Nolan celebrates, then if he became a director, what do you think would happen? He'd make bad stuff because he's not willing to celebrate where something comes from. This is common sense, but it's not really common sense anymore. And there's reasons for that, which we're not going to get into. But this always leads to the redefinition of terms. It always leads to the redefinition of ideas. It always leads to the redefinition of practices, and it always leads to the redefinition of morality. It looks something like this. First question, quid est veritas? What is truth? Now we're asking that question, what does the term truth really mean? Then it slowly alters to, is truth really truth? Let's talk about the idea of truth. Let's get into the philosophy of truth. Then it slowly alters into, does that knowledge of truth, does that really play a practical role in my life? Do I really need to know the truth to know the truth? All of a sudden, the practices become in question. And then it alters morality. All of a sudden, it becomes, there's really no such thing as the truth. It's a quick slide from what is the truth? Is truth really truth? Does truth really play a role in my life? To there is no such thing as the truth. And when there's no truth, there's no standards. And when there's no standards, there's no such thing as beauty. Because beauty is seen by the standards. Whether it be art, where you see line, where you see shape, where you basically see composition. Whether it be dance, where you see form. You ever watch So You Think You Can Dance? It's funny because people get in there and they dance with passion. And the judges, they give them, they give them props for their passion, but when it comes down to it, what do they want to see? Form. They want to see lines because that is what is beautiful. In terms of ex nihilic creation, without those standards, beauty becomes ugly. It may be called beautiful. Why would it be called beautiful? Because terms are now messed up, right? But it is ugly by ex nihilic standards. It doesn't further itself. In terms of creation from substance, it's still ugly. Why? Because it doesn't point to creation ex nihilo. So when somebody creates something that doesn't point to ex nihilo creation, it's ugly. I call this anti-art. When you go into a film and you watch a movie that just drains you, it tells you nothing about the human existence, it shows you no beauty, no inkling of hope, no inkling of God. And you guys know I watch tons of content, and I am not shy about saying that something that is controversial is awesome, and that I can find the image of God within it. But there are a few things that are just ugly, that they do not express, they just take. How does emulation ex nihilo express the difference between man and God? Beauty as ex nihilo makes the divide between God and man apparent. The truth is easy to see when beauty is applied to an object or person. So, it's the difference in echelon between talent and skill, for instance. When somebody has talent, you're like, oh, you're amazing. When somebody has skill, well, that's the work of man. And that's cool, that's amazing, but it's not amazing as somebody who has talent, who just does it naturally, who's ex nihilically provided with that skill. Emulation ex nihilo begins with the misunderstanding that there is no ex nihilo creation. Oftentimes, the presence of evident and powerful substance in our proverbial sandbox requires an explanation other than ex nihilo, and this can lead to the one-off answer of what? Am I losing you? Oftentimes, the presence of evident and powerful substance, in other words, ex nihilo creation, in our sandbox requires an explanation. I can't get over the beauty of the trees. But because it starts with the first premise that there's no such thing as ex nihilo creation, this can lead to the one-off answer that the sandbox did what? Created itself. Plus time, plus chance. And now I will let you watch something else. It's creepy, but it's not that.
What makes something right or wrong?
Hold on.
Some people believe that what is right and wrong never varies from situation to situation, and that it can be expressed in constant and unchanging commandments. They often look to religious texts. What makes something right or wrong? Some people believe that what is right and wrong never varies from situation to situation, and that it can be expressed in constant and unchanging commandments. They often look to religious texts or authorities to discover what they think a God wants them to do. A humanist view of morality is different. Humanists do not look to any God for rules,
Just listen.
but think carefully for themselves about what might be the best way to live. This approach means we have always to be empathetic and think about the effects of our choices on the happiness or suffering of the people, or sometimes other animals, concerned. We have to respect the rights and wishes of those involved, trying to find the kindest course of action or the option that will do the least harm. We have to consider carefully the particular situation we find ourselves in and not just take any rule or commandment for granted. We have to weigh up the evidence we have available to us about what the probable consequences of our actions will be. This way of thinking about what we should do is explicitly based on reason, experience, and empathy, and respect for others, rather than on tradition or deference to authority. It might sound hard, but luckily most of us do it most of the time without really thinking about it. Morality is not something that comes from outside of human beings, gifted to us by an external force like a god. When we look at our closest relatives in the animal world, we see the same basic tendencies we recognize in ourselves: affection, cooperation, all the behavior needed to live in groups and thrive. It is clear that our social instincts form the basis of morality and that they are a natural part of humanity. Of course, that is not the end of the story. The long experience of tens of thousands of years of human beings living in communities has developed and refined our morality, and we are all the lucky inheritors of that hard work. But it does not mean that there are not people who do harm or make bad choices. But ultimately, morality comes from us, not from any god. It is to do with people, with individual goodwill and social responsibility. It is about not being completely selfish, about kindness and consideration towards others. Ideas of freedom, justice, happiness, equality, fairness, and all the other values we may live by are human inventions, and we can be proud of that as we strive to live up to them.
That was Stephen Fry. You guys know who that is? He's an actor. Trying to think what he's been in. He's really tall, British. What do you guys think of that? What do you think of it in terms of what we're discussing? I am making a point now that what is beautiful is connected to what? Morality. What is beautiful is not just a statement of aesthetics, like you may have thought when you heard we were going to be talking about it for the next 5 years. What is beautiful is connected to morality. Were you listening to what he said? He said very, very pointedly that we don't need the tools that are given to us by someone else or something, because it all comes from within us. I wonder if he's ever lived in communism, or where he was during Hitler's reign in Germany and in, Western Europe. It's a pretty ridiculous concept. That is emulation ex nihilo. It believes that the box created itself. Why do we need anything? Why do we need police? Why do we need government? Why do we need, even social systems? Why do we need anything? We shouldn't, because, the box takes care of itself. Except that's not true, and it's ridiculous to think so. Emulation ex nihilo begins with the misunderstanding that there is no ex nihilo creation. What did he immediately say? There's no God. God didn't give us anything. Oftentimes, the presence of evident and powerful substance in our proverbial sandbox requires an explanation other than ex nihilo. In other words, there are things like love that exist, so where did that come from? This can lead to the one-off answer that the sandbox created itself plus time plus chance. Sounds an awful lot like social contract theory. Sounds an awful lot like social evolution. Sounds an awful lot like evolution. This allows for the advent of beauty to be recognized, but only so far as the beauty points to what can be discovered. to continue to find beauty but not be able to explain it leads to the rational move of being what? Unrational. You can't explain what you see, so what do you got to do? Make something up. You got to be unrational, effectively removing beauty and truth and objectivity from what? Reason. Anybody know what the Enlightenment is? The Enlightenment was an era in philosophical development where science began to trump philosophy or religion. The church, the Roman Catholic Church, had put an emphasis on ex nihilo creation without having a proper emphasis on creation from substance. So because they had done that, and it was all about God, but not about man creating in consensus with God, then when a man came and said something like, you know, I'm pretty sure that the earth isn't the center of the universe. Well, what had to happen? They had to be silenced. Because that angered the system that was present. But how does that work when science is popping up everywhere and showing that all these things are true? What does the church do in order to preserve itself? If we can't admit the truth, then what do? We either admit a lie or we turn the other cheek. We go into ignorance and indifference mode, right? And we preserve the lie by saying, you know, that's your area. I don't really have anything to do with that. The church speaks to religion and God and things of a higher nature. Science is its own area. Thus, the Enlightenment. And once the Enlightenment happened, religion, specifically Roman Catholicism, as the main reigning religion, lost its foothold on what? Reason. All of a sudden, reason isn't reason anymore within the church. Reason is science. We don't deal with reason. We deal with what? Faith. Right? Because it's all about faith. Faith has nothing to do with reason. Faith has everything to do with a leap. An unreasonable leap of faith. Because that's how you maintain God. And where did that start? It started from the church itself having an untenable connection to ex nihilo creation. And having an untenable connection to creation through consensus, and having an untenable connection to creation through substance. And all of a sudden, what was beautiful became what? What was unreasonable. And that is why you have the David, for instance, commissioned by the Roman Catholic Church, who is not circumcised. Why? Because he doesn't need to be circumcised. Why does he not need to be circumcised? Because it isn't important that we get the details right. Because the church isn't about reason, it's about faith. And beauty has nothing to do with reason anymore. It has to do with faith. It's all about how you interpret things. What did that lead to? That led to artwork doing the same thing. And that art doing the same thing really influenced the German philosophers, who then turned and influenced the world. And those German philosophers, they created psychology, and that brought Germany into a place of extreme depression. And as we know, once Germany entered into a state of extreme depression, it decided that it needed to have a revolution and get it back. And so what did it do? It started World War I. And when that didn't work, it needed to get it back again. So what did it do? It started World War II. See the point? What was Hitler obsessed with? Anyone know? He was obsessed with art. He was specifically obsessed with beauty. What did he have? He had an unrealistic, untenable connection to ex nihilic beauty. He was looking into the occult like no other. He was trying to make, he was emulation ex nihilo. He was trying to create something that cannot be created. And in doing so, he practically destroyed the world. Is it then so hard with this context to understand that the people that he would pick on were who? The chosen people of God, who have built innately into their system an understanding of working with God, creation through consensus. Do you see all the dots? I know this is long, guys, but I'm setting the tone here for 5 years. The results of emulation ex nihilo within ex nihilo creation. Aesthetics. Aesthetics are how things look. Intentful design becomes unintentful reactive expression. So instead of it being, I designed this, look at how these things were put together. I used the mathematical equation, so on and so forth. I was progressive in that. I've made, like Da Vinci, airplanes and bicycles and all sorts of stuff that people wouldn't be able to figure out for so many years because he was intentful about his designs. It becomes Jackson Pollock standing on top of a ledge, throwing paint onto a canvas, letting the expression fall where it falls. Let the feeling guide you. Relationship. Intentful and God-inspired love becomes infatuation and narrow, self-inspired machinations with immature ramblings of tolerance mixed with CW dialogue. That and Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau inspired social contract theory. The most despicable, unbeautiful, ugly thing that I saw in, 2013, I want to say, maybe 2014, was when Chris Martin and Gwyneth Paltrow separated. Anybody know what happened there? They had a consensus to separate because, their time was done. And that's beautiful. That's really what marriage is all about, right? It's recognizing and working with the other partner, even if that is to separate ways. What? That's beautiful? That's ugly. That's just social contract theory put in the guise of marriage. I use you to the point that you can be used, and when I'm done with you, I'm done. But as long as we walk away with a smile on our face, that's cool. Psychology, being made in God's image as a whole person in body, mind, and spirit, and excelling to meet that standard becomes a looming and unanswerable question of nature versus nurture, with an impotent emphasis on blaming the generations that came before it, the circumstances of one's station, and the finer points of sociological evolution. That's what emulation ex nihilo does. That's what seeing beauty through the lens of anything but God, and too much of God and too little of man, or too little of man and too much of God does. What is God's answer to emulation ex nihilo? It's a really simple one because he's awesome like that. Yeshua, Jesus, the answer to emulation ex nihilo. Inverted apologetics. In his life, in his everything, taking into account where mankind has wronged itself and flipping it so that the understanding, he presents himself as an inverted picture because that's all we can see. The king comes as a slave. the man comes as a baby. The head of an empire comes as the defeated empire. And so on and so forth. It's an inverted apologetic because we don't look at beauty correctly. We bring ourselves to the point of seeing things as beautiful that are not beautiful. Our struggle in this church for the next 5 years is to recognize the difference between emulation ex nihilo, creation ex nihilo, and creation from substance. To create via a consensus with God, creation ex consentio. To familiarize ourselves with ex nihilo creation across all fields. What do I mean by that? To study beauty everywhere. All things. Music, science, art, drama, everything. Relationship. To study what it is that people say is beautiful. To exemplify what is actually beautiful in these fields. And then to use the principles of organization across all fields to exemplify this beauty. Understanding their relationship to God's creation and participating in it with Him. To seek a deeper understanding of the elements of beauty as well as the principles of organization to fortify this truth. To hold fast to the ex nihilic nature of this beauty in the face of those who would claim beauty to be emulation ex nihilo. So, I talked about the tools of organization again. To give you an example of how this works. The tools were shape and proportion, positioning, cropping, path, direction, negative space, all that stuff, right? The shape and proportion we always put through the filter of Christ. So what's the shape and proportion of Christ? He was Jewish. He was male. He's from a slave race. He's a baby. The positioning, obviously, he was Jewish again. He's from a slave race. It was during the Roman times. The cropping, real time and real space. He narrowed himself down to Bethlehem, Jerusalem, so on and so forth. The path of direction followed by the viewer's eye when they observe an image. You can see a clear path of sacrifice, of teaching, of suffering. The negative space. You can see the things around him as humanity, the temptation, the disciples even. The list goes on and on and on. You can take and see these things across all fields. So when I look at Jackson Pollock and I look at what he calls art, I need to say, how does Christ fit into that? Because when I look at a piece of art, it should have all those things, right? I should be able to see the story of Christ as told in those things. Now, it may be somewhat obscured, but it should still be there. I should still be able to see God moving and the image of God moving within those things. But as I look at art continuing to develop and it turns into anti-art and I can't see those things because they don't use those tools. They don't use proportion. They don't use line and so on and so forth. They don't use form. I need to call it like it is. I need to call it ugly, not beautiful. And we have a tendency in our generation to look at things and say, that's so beautiful. When we look at men and women swapping the right relationship before God for where their lusts burn, as Romans said, and we call that beautiful, that is an affront to God. It's not beautiful. And we need to learn to understand what that is. I hope you understand through this conversation why it is that God calls it an abomination. We recognize what is truly beautiful by looking for evidence of beauty, by looking at Christ, by looking at Scripture, by looking at creation ex nihilo, by looking at creation ex consentio, submitting to the orders and principles attributed to beauty, by guarding against imbalance in the creative process. No God without man, no man without God. I'm almost done, guys. I thought I had my other document open. I don't. Does anybody have any questions so far? There's a lot. I know you're digesting a lot. I want you to consider something. God's first relevant creation for our universe was what? Light. Very good. God's first creation for our universe was light. We in Scripture are called not merely users of light, but there's an aspect of light that's part of us. I talked about that before, bioluminescence and all that sort of stuff, right? I would like to point out to you that light is how the shadows are cast, is it not? And what was it that I said was the in-between of the form and the shadow? I called that beautiful, right? That's where beauty is found, in the light. You with me? I would like to point out to you that Satan is an angel of light. That he was built, that he was created, that he was gifted with the control and manipulation of light. He can emulate the creative act using light. He can use this to mesmerize us. Mesmerization, of course, goes back to that word I used earlier, glimmer. He can use that to cast a spell on us, to trick us. There's a war fought in the realm of presentation as we speak right now, every week, going to all of our devices. Using what? Light. Satanic method is the presentation of the previous creation through reducing and redistributing it by the removal of its form and structure in organic space and transmitting this as a new contract of light through various forms of technological advancement. I'm making a point here. That there is not only a war with the definition of things and the terms of things as there used to have been in the past, but there is a war with an understanding of the actual reality of form. Organic versus synthetic. And this is where beauty also has a part to play. Our understanding of organic versus synthetic. What is beautiful? Genetically modified organisms look beautiful. They're genetically modified specifically to look beautiful, right? To emulate ex nihilo at its peak. To basically emulate what we consider to be pre-fallen fruit, right? But with that said, it's synthetic. It's a trick of the eyes. It's mesmerism because it has nothing to it. When we look at men and the tendency toward pornography, you know that pornography is responsible for the spread of so much technology? What type of technology specifically? Visual. How do we do that? By what can make something look more beautiful. By taking the glamour process and applying it specifically to the sexual act. So what do? We have created systems by which it is constantly knocking at our doors. When we talk about indifference and ignorance, it's the same thing. When we talk about information, we believe in synthetic information in this generation. Meta is what we call it. So we'll take it out of the realm of calling it synthetic and we'll call it meta. It's the same thing. We believe in meta information. It's not real. Just because you've watched a Christopher Nolan movie means that you know what it means to direct. Just because you've IMDb'd that person, just introduced you to IMDb. Just because you've IMDb'd that person and read the spoofs and the trivia and the plot, you know that movie? That's how we live in this generation. It's true because Wikipedia says so. Yeah, because Google told me. The godly method is interaction of his organic creation, ex nihilo. with the agents of light, as well as the hierarchy of light as it pertains to creation, to work together at a frequency which radiates with the ex-nihilic presentation of light, blah, blah, blah. I was going to do an exercise with you guys, but it's too much. They say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That's what they say. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I would challenge your perception of who that beholder is, though, because it's not man, it's God. Beauty is in the eye of God. He created us as a piece of art. He created us as artwork for his pleasure. So we need to look at what is beautiful in the eye of God, not in the eye of us. Okay, one last video, very short. I would cancel this video for you guys, but honestly, this is a video I wanted to watch. I love them. So, get this up on the screen. My precursor to this video is be wary. If I can find it. Be wary of what is presenting itself to you. There we go. Sanctuary 1. Done. Swipe up.
Oh, no, I know Hamlet. And what he might say with irony, I say with conviction. What a piece of work is man. How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form, in moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god.
Surely you don't see your species like that, do you?
I see us one day becoming that, Q.
Star Trek, The Next Generation, circa 1986. Hamlet, which is what he was quoting, for the record. How like a god man is. I see us one day becoming that. That was 1986. Hamlet was like way before that, like what, 1200 or something? Something crazy like that, Enlightenment era, FYI. And now, we will go back to Scripture. Psalms chapter 8. O Lord, our Lord, your majestic name fills the earth. Your glory is higher than the heavens. You have taught children and infants to tell of your strength, silencing your enemies and all who oppose you. When I look at the night sky and see the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars you set in place, what are mere mortals that you should think of them? Human beings that you should care for them. Yet you made them only a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You gave them charge of everything you made, putting all things under their authority, the flocks and the herds and all the wild animals, the birds in the sky, the fish in the sea, everything that swims, the ocean currents. O Lord, our Lord, your majestic name fills the earth. How like a god man is. What is man? What is man that you are mindful of us, God? See the difference in the concept of beauty? That's the difference. I would like you to, in the next 5 years, in the next 1 year, in the next week, I would like you to pay attention to where the differences lie. I would like you to pay attention to how it is that you are perceiving beauty and what it is that these inputs into your life are saying is beautiful. Because, like I said, taking a small kernel of secular humanism and replacing beauty started World War II. Imagine how things can be now with the way that communication is. Imagine the direction that everything is going, moving away from organic to synthetic, moving away from true to meta. This is a war, people, that we are fighting for the very nature of our souls. That's all I got for you.